Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm taking a look at I'm continuing basically with this technocratic theme or the technocracy theme. Last time I looked at the food industry, and before that I looked at technocracy in general and the different areas that it's going to affect society. Today I'm looking at this thing called the carbon currency, or the carbon credits as they say. And the reality is that this idea of the carbon currency or energy credits and such things is a technocratic idea, part of this technocracy ideology, which started around the 1930s. Well, the idea of technocracy started before that, but the organization began in the 1930s, although it didn't last very long. It developed certain ideas which were adopted by the Trilateral Commission in the mid-70s or early 70s, in the idea of how they're going to manipulate or control the world. When I say control the world, they want to create a system or their own understanding of a system that can benefit the world. I don't know if it benefits the world, it benefits the wealthy in the world. But they see that as the best way for the world to operate, basically. So today I'm looking at this, as I said, I'm looking at this carbon currency and carbon credits. The carbon currency hasn't come into full effect yet, but it's something they're working on. But carbon credits exist at the moment, and certain corporations are purchasing carbon credits. But just let's look at the general idea of this technocratic theme. Modern emphasis, this is from the book Technocracy Rising. Modern emphasis on curtailing carbon fuel consumption that causes global warming and CO2 emissions is essentially a product of early technocratic thinking. This is the thinking going back to the 30s, as I said. To facilitate this equilibrium between man and nature, technocracy proposes that citizens will receive energy certificates in order to operate the economy. And these energy certificates are issued individually to every adult of the entire population. When making purchases of their goods or services, an individual surrenders the energy certificate properly identified and signed. And there are two key differences between a price-based money and energy certificates. The first is money is generic to the holder, while certificates are individually registered to each citizen. So money, basically anybody can have. You can exchange money almost anonymously, it's just cash. But these certificates will be registered to you. Anyway, money persists while certificates expire. The latter facet will generally hinder, if not altogether prevent, the accumulation of wealth and property. So these certificates have a time limit on them. And this carbon currency, from the same book, control over energy makes possible the original technocracy goal of implementing a carbon-based energy certificate that would replace the existing price-based currencies, as I just said. Such a currency would also be the lifeblood of a green economy based on sustainable development. So this idea of sustainable development existed prior to the more recent UN idea of sustainable development. In fact, those ideas come from the Trilateral Commission, who decided they want to bring up this new narrative, or this narrative basically about what humans are doing in this industrialized world in particular is causing damage to the environment. So there needs to be measures made to mitigate, particularly this carbon-based damage that they claim is taking place. So that's just a brief look at the fact that this technocratic idea came before the carbon currency, this recent carbon currency. You know, the UN notion of dealing with climate change only came along maybe 50 years ago. I think it started around the 70s. And this is when the Trilateral Commission began to exist. along with the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome, in one of their books or scientific papers, came out with the idea that climate change, or the dangers to the climate, is something that man needs to come together to work on. It sounds like something that's benevolent, that humans should come together and sort out the issues relating to the climate. But some are arguing that the whole climate narrative and the research going into it that proves that climate change is caused by man-made endeavors is somehow flawed. There are scientists who don't follow the climate narrative, and there are those who, well, the majority seem to go along with it, but there's a number of people who are experts in the field who understand the dynamics of that type of research, who are saying that basically a lot of the information is false and a lot of the research is false. So anyway, let's look at the carbon currency in detail. The carbon currency is a tradable carbon asset and the economic instrument of the global carbon reward policy. The main function of the currency is a store of value to deliver climate finance at a scale that can address the ambition of the Paris Climate Agreement. So it doesn't function as a medium of exchange, and therefore the currency is not considered a type of money, and it is unique because it will finance mitigation at speed and scale without imposing direct costs on citizens, business or governments. And the currency is analogous to precious metal currencies that are traded in the foreign exchange, including gold, silver, platinum and palladium. So it will represent carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide equivalents that are strategically mitigated under long-term contracts between the project owners and an authority that manages the currency. So I'm just looking at the technical breakdown of what this carbon currency is. So it's saying here that it will be a store of value. Continue. It will be a store of value because the exchange rate of the currency will be managed by central banks with an internationally coordinated monetary policy. Central banks will defend the currency price floor by buying this carbon currency in the foreign exchange. And they will fund purchases using central bank reserves that they may create as required. Okay. So central banks basically will be involved in the purchasing of these carbon credits or carbon currencies. So I think that's where the financial side of their backing comes from. And this is from the Technocracy Rising book itself. So local currencies would still remain in play for a time, but they would eventually wither and be fully replaced by the carbon currency, much the same way that the euro displaced the individual European currencies back in the 70s or 80s. So Technocracy's keen focus on the efficient use of energy is likely the first hint of a sustained ecological environmental movement in the United States. So, although it's said in an earlier paragraph that they don't intend, it's not going to replace the currency, it's clear that the ultimate aim is that these carbon currency or credits or whatever you want to call them is going to bring in a new type of financial system based on the use of energy, carbon and the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's the whole theory. But whether it's going to be a reality, we shall see based on some of the information I'll provide in a while. So each unit of carbon, of this carbon currency, will represent 1 ton of CO2 strategically mitigated in the atmosphere for 100 years. So they'll find a way of measuring what 1 ton or 1 metric ton of CO2 in the atmosphere is. And that's what your unit of carbon currency will be worth. But measuring that will be the problem. As I said, I'll mention some of the fraudulent schemes that are currently taking place regarding carbon credits. The term strategically mitigated refers to 2 kinds of mitigated mass. One, direct air capture, which is also called carbon dioxide removal. So these are ways of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, basically. And number two, conventional mitigation through emissions reductions or avoidance. So this second method is where they're using processes or changing the process that we use, those processes that we use that normally would produce carbon dioxide. They want to find alternatives, basically, which don't produce carbon dioxide. So it will not be used as a medium of exchange. It will not be legal tender in any country. It will be issued as an incentive and will behave as a financial asset. That's contradictory to what I've just read. This is supposed to be explaining what a carbon currency is and the different facets of it, but some are arguing that it could be a medium of exchange, and those who are saying, as I read a minute ago, that the currencies that we're currently using will disappear, and carbon currency will be used to buy and purchase items, which means it will become a medium of exchange. So I don't know why they had put that part in. So it's going on to say it's a market tool for establishing a new social agreement in terms of financing strategically important mitigation outcomes to achieve the Paris climate goals. This whole idea of meeting these Paris climate goals is also a false narrative. So if the whole climate change narrative is false, all these organizations set up under the United Nations to achieve certain goals, particularly say this net zero by 2050, that's the reduction of carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. All of those are false narratives which are used to get people thinking in a particular way, which cause them to also behave in a particular way in terms of being more encouraged to start using these new forms of currency and to change their lifestyles in a particular way. Like these 15-minute cities, for example, is one of the methods they want to use to supposedly reduce carbon dioxide production, having people traveling closer to home rather than traveling long distances to use less fuel and so forth. So could argue that their intention is to lock people into certain regions under the guise of this net zero program. But in what you're doing really is you're restricting people's movements based on a narrative which some claim is false. Anyway, let me continue. Let me continue and move on to, I'm moving on to more into the financialization. What they're talking about when they say financialization of nature is turning nature into something you can trade, buy and purchase. Natural assets basically that can be traded and bought and purchased. So that's what I'll be looking at now, once I organize this stuff here. So, anyway, we'll move on a minute. Anyway, this is from an article from the Radical Ecological Democracy website. A profound contradiction between our dominant economic system and the Earth's life support structure continues to endanger human existence. This is what they call neoliberalism. The economic system we live by demands endless growth and consumption of resources in order to continue to function. It is now perfectly clear that the two systems are on a massive collision course. So if you're concerned about nature, you can't also agree to this neoliberalism idea of, or the Western economic system idea of continuous growth, continuous use of resources, mass use of resources at that, and the continued expansion in the use of resources without replacing the resources that you're taking out of the oil, out of the soil. So that's what the article is arguing here. And this goes on to say, regarding the financialization of nature, this determination to financialize nature has assumes that if nature becomes part of our economic system, it can be given a price and traded like any other commodity. And when its services such as regulating climate or providing food and medicine become scarce, their market price will increase accordingly. This is claimed to be an incentive to protect those services, but in fact, a means to increase profits for those. So once you own nature, and you know how this demand and supply idea works, particularly in the Western system, when something becomes scarce, it becomes a lot more expensive. So if they financialize nature and certain products become more scarce, then even people living in a natural environment may find it, because they want to basically, under the guise of this carbon currency and carbon credits, as I mentioned in a minute, they want to start grabbing people's land. People have their natural inherited land. They'll be forcing people to, instead of growing food, you'll be planting trees that is supposed to absorb this carbon dioxide. So that they're like beginning control over your land and how you can use your land, being able to determine how you can use your land. Anyway, the financialization project has taken a number of forms over the last 3 decades, using different kinds of market instruments, such as, there's several here: the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, the clean development mechanism, that's CDM, wetland banking, verified carbon standard. These are different terminologies which are used under this financialization of nature concept. What is new is now that there are terms that conceal these instruments behind a concept which sounds positive to most people, and furthermore does not constitute an instrument in itself, making it more difficult to detect its deficiencies. Important examples are the concepts of nature-based solutions and nature positive. So it's going on to further say that another new booster for the financialization project is the drive to turn at least 30% of all land and oceans into protected areas. Some of this land is owned by indigenous people. So part of their program, as I said, is to grab 30% of the land on the earth. Is quite a lot of land if you think about it. So they want to start supposedly using that in order to mitigate the damage done by humans to the environment, or mainly by Western man to the environment. So I'm going to look at now some of the land issues relating to these projects, these carbon credit projects, and you'll find out here the type of things that they're doing, to the type of fraudulent activities that are taking place in regards to how this carbon credit system actually operates. And you see that there's not a lot of transparency taking place. Anyway, this is from Mbogo. This is from an article. Carbon credit, from a website, Manga Base. I think it's an article about carbon credit and the land issues. Communal lands, the combined size of Portugal, have been taken over by the corporate interests for carbon offsetting schemes across the global south. Although it doesn't sound much, Portugal is not a very big country, but the process is just beginning, as they'll mention later on. The Report by Grain, a non-profit supporting small farmers, identified 9.1 million hectares of land, more than half of it in Africa, had undergone such a change since 2016. In most of the 279 carbon projects surveyed, foreign companies acquired large tracts of land traditionally used by local communities for grazing or farming, and converted them into plantations of fast-growing trees like eucalyptus and acacia or bamboo. And these are trees that people don't normally use. They have no real use. But why do you plant something like eucalyptus in a territory or region of the world where it doesn't naturally grow? So what they're doing in their programs also is to plant the type of plant that may not naturally exist in these territories. Acacia is okay in Africa, or maybe, but even bamboo, that's also from a particular part of the world. Would you not plant trees that are indigenous to these regions? Anyway, It goes on to say, this is another article about Microsoft and what they've been doing in terms of these carbon credits. Microsoft's deal with TIG, reportedly the largest carbon dioxide removal credit transaction in history, is just one of the many investments Microsoft is making in tree plantations as a way to mitigate its emissions. The Dutch agribusiness lender Rabobank is another source of carbon credits for the tech company. It too is acquiring land in Brazil for tree plantations. In this instance with a local agribusiness family with a track record of illegal deforestation and fraud. But most of the carbon credits of Rabobank sells to Microsoft are from its program to plant trees on lands of small coffee and cocoa growers in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It's a program called Acorn, and basically Microsoft buys carbon credits from Rabobank, and Rabobank as its agents in these countries, in these regions of the world that have these projects, so-called projects, under this program called Acorn. So they have their way, basically what it's saying is they have some way of measuring the number or size of shade trees that small farmers plant on their farms, and then calculate the carbon they've removed from the atmosphere. But I'll mention the fraudulent aspect of that in a while. Then it sells the carbon to Microsoft as carbon credits for about $38 a piece, taking about a 20% cut for itself and its local partner, and paying farmers what's left of the proceeds. So a big problem with Rabobank's scheme identified in an investigation of the project with cocoa farmers in Ivory Coast is that it is vastly overestimated. It's overestimating the carbon removed. It's exaggerating basically the carbon removed. In this case by 600%. What's more, the Ivory Coast government says Rabobank is likely double dipping as its project overlaps with a World Bank funded scheme that has already generated and sold carbon credits from the trees planted on the small cocoa farms in the same area. So you can have two different organizations selling these carbon credits to different corporate entities, claiming that a certain amount of carbon dioxide is being removed from the atmosphere because of this project, but you're selling it to different people. So more than one company is buying and can now claim that it's mitigating its carbon dioxide emissions by giving money to this group or organization to plant trees. And yet these same trees that have been planted are also being claimed by other corporate entities as their effort to mitigate climate change or carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. So there's some deception, some fraud going on the side of the organizations that are selling the carbon credits. But you could also argue that there's deception going on the side of these corporate entities who may or may not know that their credits have already been sold to other entities, business entities. In the past year, the Liberian government has agreed to sell about 10% of the West African country's land, equivalent to 10,931 square kilometers, to Dubai-based company Blue Carbon to preserve forests that might otherwise be logged and used for farming, the primary livelihood of many communities. So they're taking away farming land from the local people to sell to these foreign corporations for so-called CO2 projects. I think there's a lot of greed going on there. People within the government are making money from like this Blue Carbon, this Dubai-based company, at the cost of their own people. Blue Carbon, which did not respond to repeated emails and calls seeking comment, plans to make money from this conservation by selling carbon credits to polluters to offset their emissions as they burn fossil fuels. Some experts argue that the model offers little climate benefit. Some are labeling it carbon colonialism. And then it further goes on to say that some activists are saying the government has no right to sell this land, no legal right to sell the land, as it belongs to indigenous landowners. They have their own indigenous method of land ownership, which doesn't give the government right to sell their land, basically. Anyway, this is another article from the same site. It's a transfer of land that could be used for local livelihoods, but it's now prioritizing the interests of corporations. It's prioritizing the interests of government officials who want some money, who want a lot of money from these corporations or these organizations that are involved in this carbon credit. I won't call it a scam. It's a system, but it's not very, at the moment, it's not very organized. There's still a lot of loopholes that people can exploit to make their money from it. This is just the beginning. Just the beginning of something much larger. The scale and spread we're already seeing with some major players involved is a worrying indication. So they're basically saying the scam that's coming from this scheme means that there'll be a lot of people making a lot of money from this idea, selling carbon credits to corporations based on false information, basically, is something that is going to grow. The study identified 279 large-scale carbon projects, half of them in China, India, Brazil, Colombia. However, Africa hosts the largest expanse of such projects, covering more than 5.2 million hectares. That's 12.8 million acres. The largest project is in Niger, which is 2.2 million hectares in Niger's semi-arid Sahel region. Also gave NASDAQ-listed African agriculture holdings the rights to local underground water. So it's not just the soil and growing trees that they're gaining access to. They're also gaining access to the water under the ground. And in regard to some of the fraudulent activities that have been taking place, this next section will look at that. First, what is carbon fraud? Due to rising pressure to meet net zero targets both through legislation as well as through public opinion, carbon trading and carbon markets have grown significantly. At the same time, reports of non-compliant behavior have increased. There are numerous factors that make both compliance and voluntary markets particularly vulnerable. Firstly, purchasers have limited insight into the reduction procedure. So companies purchasing these carbon credits don't really know how the system works. They're just paying for these carbon credits, but they don't know how the reduction procedures actually work, and they don't know how the verification processes also work. Typical cases include ghost credits, in which refer to carbon reductions that are entirely made up. Closely related to this are cases of overstated impact. So carbon reductions that are completely false. Then you have overstated impact, where the amount of carbon offset by these projects is completely exaggerated. Another example is double counting, which occurs when carbon reduction is claimed multiple times or by multiple parties by using the same credit in different trading schemes under different jurisdictions. So as I said, they're using the same carbon credits, or they're being sold to different companies, basically, and the companies don't have any way of verifying whether what they've bought is actually genuine, whether others have actually bought the same credit. There's no way to check. A lack of safety precautions of the emissions registry itself, such as the lack of transaction monitoring, may also increase the fraud. So the whole process is fraudulent or not regulated properly, basically, whether because it's new or whether because people are taking advantage of the fact that it's not regulated to make quick money for themselves. Or the corporations themselves are possibly they possibly know that this is taking place, but as long as they can put some money somewhere and claim that they're making an effort to mitigate the damage to the environment, then they'll buy these credits. And I mentioned in a while the fact that these credits are, because of this, credits are actually much cheaper than they should be. Other concerns revolve around the lack of additionality or permanence of carbon credits, according to much of the criticism aimed at the newly adopted rules for carbon markets under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement pertains to a lack of transparency and oversight. This is from a study done by Cambridge University into the carbon credit scheme. And the article is headlined, "The majority of carbon offset schemes are significantly overestimated the levels of deforestation they are preventing," according to this, or according to science.org. This means that many of the carbon credits bought by companies to balance out emissions are not tied to real-world forest preservation, as claimed. An international team of scientists and economists led by the University of Cambridge and VU Amsterdam found that millions of carbon credits are based on crude calculations that inflate the conservation successes of voluntary REDD plus projects. Basically, people are these, as I said, they're claiming, they're making false claims basically about about the achievements of these projects, basically about the amount of carbon that has been reduced by the work of these projects. So carbon credits provide major polluters with some semblance of climate credentials. As I was saying, it gives the corporation some kind of credentials in terms of how they're perceived. If they're perceived to be purchasing a lot of these carbon credits, and these high purchases of carbon credits makes it seem as if they're legitimate, good companies that are very concerned about climate change and are actually doing something about it, when in reality they're purchasing something which is not really causing an indifference to the levels of carbon dioxide. So the whole thing's a scam. The narrative of climate change is a scam at the moment anyway. In the economic aspect to do with corporations, you find that that's also a scam. Corporations are paying for cheap carbon credits which are not really doing anything, just giving the appearance that there's some kind of corporate concern for what's happening to the climate. Yet we can see that claims of saving vast swathes of forest from the chainsaw to balance emissions are overblown, said study senior author Professor Andreas Contolian from Cambridge's Department of Land Economy. He points out that overestimations of forest preservation have allowed the number of carbon credits on the market to keep rising. In turn suppresses the prices. Potential buyers benefit from consistently low prices created by the flood of credits. It means that companies can tick their net zero box at the lowest possible cost. So it's been flooded by false credits, and credits which may be from the same source or the same forest or same piece of land, and they're being sold off cheaply. As I said, it seems to be all a bit of a scam unless they find a way of making it more transparent in the future, but at the moment it still has a long way to go. The forest carbon offsets approved by the world's leading certifier and used by Disney, Shell, Gucci and other big corporations are largely worthless and could make global eating worse, according to a new investigation. This is from, let me have a look here. It's just an article in The Guardian, the UK's The Guardian. Anyway, the research into Vera, the world's leading carbon standard for the rapidly growing 2 billion voluntary offsets market, has found that based on analysis of a significant percentage of the projects, more than 90% of their rainforest offset credits among the most commonly used by companies are likely to be phantom credits and do not represent genuine carbon reductions. So where's the money going? Really? It's going to organizations which are not really doing it. They're playing on paper, really. Playing games on paper, claiming that the reductions are being made when nothing is being done. The analysis raises questions over credits bought by a number of internationally renowned companies. Some of them have labeled their products carbon neutral, or have told their consumers they can fly, buy new clothes, or eat certain foods without making the climate crisis worse. The 9-month investigation has been undertaken by The Guardian, the German weekly Die Zeit and Source Material, a non-profit investigative journalist organization. So basically it's saying that a lot of these corporations are not purchasing, they're giving money towards something, yet nothing is happening. It seems that they're just paying to look as if they're doing something benevolent towards their society or to the world, but they're not actually doing anything. So anyway, that was a look at this climate, and this climate relating to the carbon credits system and how it's in its current stage, how it looks and what's really going on in terms of are these companies or corporations really doing anything to mitigate this carbon dioxide presence in the atmosphere. But having said that, if the whole thing is false in the first place, it means they don't really need to do anything. And if they're giving money just for the sake of appearances, you might say, what is the real interest? Is the real interest this technocratic interest of manipulating the mindset of people across the world into becoming part of their new infrastructure, their new global system of, it's a system of control, basically. Controlling the, last time I dealt with the food issue and what they intend to do with the food, turning away from naturally grown food towards food grown in a laboratory. They want to control the food system. They want to control people's movements via the 15-minute cities. All of these are based on the idea of damage being done to the climate. Change the food system so that you don't produce as much carbon dioxide. Live in 15-minute cities also, where you travel less distances to get to wherever you need to go or to do whatever you need to do, also to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide produced by vehicles and so forth, and then create a new financial system based on carbon dioxide again, this carbon credits, carbon currency system. The next program also will be, I think, within this technocracy theme. And yeah. So anyway, that was a look at these carbon credits and carbon currency and the scam that seems to be taking place relating to the buying and selling of credits, and whether these credits actually have any kind of backing in terms of whether they actually mean anything. Because if you're buying a carbon credit and there's no credit to supposedly mitigate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you're buying something that has already taken place, but you're paying for something to happen, but it's not going to take place, basically. Or you're buying, multiple people are buying the same credit. So you're buying the same forest, and yet you're supposed to be paying for something that your corporation can claim, yes, even though we're producing carbon dioxide in our company, we have done something to reduce it somewhere else. But in reality, you're not reducing anything. Anyway, I think that's it for today.